Farrah Fawcett's possible secret love life revealed in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. It's all part of a courtroom fight over a $30 million portrait of the actress.
Her face was never really gone. It just kept reappearing at the exact moments culture decided it was ready to remember her again. Farrah Fawcett's image sits at a rare intersection of beauty, television history, and media mythology that modern platforms keep rediscovering in cycles. From her breakout on Charlie's Angels to the 1976 red swimsuit poster that quietly became one of the most reproduced images in pop culture history, every era seems to pull her back into focus for a different reason, and the latest wave is no exception. So, why is everyone talking about Farrah Fawcett again? The real reason will shock you. Let's start from the very beginning. Entry into Hollywood and early career breakthrough. By the mid-1960s, after leaving the University of Texas at Austin, Farrah Fawcett stepped out of an academic path in microbiology and into Los Angeles with no industry foothold or established credits. Casting calls led to rejection more often than opportunity, and the roles she did land were small enough to be almost invisible. Commercials, print advertisements, and brief background appearances that rarely gave her more than seconds on screen. She worked within the commercial advertising circuit that powered television, appearing in campaigns for consumer products. But here, faces were meant to be seen, not remembered individually. Even so, she began accumulating a presence in the public eye. By the end of the decade, that accumulation started to matter. Advertising agencies began to recognize her as a dependable visual presence, and she became one of the more frequently booked commercial models in Los Angeles. She appeared in campaigns for major consumer brands such as shampoo and cosmetics products that dominated American television advertising at the time, placing her face into millions of living rooms without yet attaching her name to it. This was a critical transition point. She was visible, but still anonymous. Her earliest film work reflected this same liminal status. In 1969, she appeared in Love is a Funny Thing, directed by Claude Lelouch, filmed partly in the United States, including scenes in Arizona. The role was minimal, no speaking lines, no character arc, essentially a brief visual presence in a larger narrative. It did not establish her as an actress, but it did place her inside the machinery of international film production for the first time. The following year, she secured a more defined but still limited role in Myra Breckenridge, a controversial film adaptation of Gore Vidal's novel starring Raquel Welch. The production itself was already under public scrutiny for its provocative themes and chaotic reputation during filming. Fawcett's role remained secondary, and later commentary on the film would largely overshadow individual performances. Yet for her, it marked a shift. She was no longer just appearing in advertisements or background frames. She was now inside credited feature filmmaking. During this period, she began making guest appearances on established network shows, including The Flying Nun and Mayberry RFD, both part of the dominant broadcast landscape of American family television in the late 1960s and early 70s. These roles were typically episodic, often designed around brief character interactions rather than sustained development. Still, they functioned as a critical training ground, giving her exposure to fast production schedules, multi-camera setups, and televised storytelling. What emerged from these scattered roles was not immediate stardom, but pattern recognition within the industry. Casting directors began to associate her with a specific visual identity: clean-cut, photogenic, distinctly American, in a way that advertising agencies valued highly during that era. That identity became both an advantage and a constraint. It made her highly marketable for commercials and light television roles, but it also risked locking her into a narrow type before she had the chance to define her range. By the early 1970s, she had appeared in dozens of commercials, her face circulating widely enough that audiences began to recognize her without necessarily knowing her name. This was the quiet threshold of fame. Great things were about to happen. Rise to fame and cultural icon status. In 1976, Charlie's Angels premiered on ABC, introducing Farrah Fawcett as Jill Monroe. The show itself was part of a larger television experiment by producer Aaron Spelling, designed to blend action, glamour, and serialized crime storytelling into a primetime format that could compete with network giants of the era. It debuted on September 22, 1976, and within weeks, it became a cultural signal. Fawcett's character was written as athletic, independent, and visually striking. But what happened off-screen mattered more than the scripts. The feathered hairstyle she wore on the show, soon labeled the Farrah Flip, escaped television entirely and entered salons, magazines, and department store advertisements. It became a replicated style across the United States, a look that required no explanation. Hairdressers reported customers bringing magazine cutouts instead of verbal descriptions, asking simply for the Farrah hair. The transformation into a beauty icon accelerated when the 1976 red swimsuit poster was released. Shot by photographer Bruce McBroom, the image showed her smiling in a one-piece suit, posed outdoors in natural light. The poster sold over 12 million copies. It became one of the best-selling posters in commercial history. At its peak, it sold more than 6 million copies in its first year alone, placing it ahead of most entertainment merchandise of the decade. Unlike typical promotional materials, it existed independently of narrative. This was Farrah Fawcett, unfiltered, unchained, unmatchable. What made the rise more intense was the speed at which multiple industries began extracting value from it. Television ratings for Charlie's Angels climbed rapidly, with the show reaching nearly 59% of U.S. television households at its peak during its first season. That level of viewership meant that nearly 1 in every 2 households watching TV at the time was tuned into the same program. For a single actress, this translated into visibility on an unprecedented scale. The commercial machine responded immediately. Her image appeared across lunchboxes, dolls, board games, magazine covers, and licensed merchandise that expanded far beyond traditional celebrity branding of the 1970s. This was early mass commodification of a television personality at a scale that blurred the line between performer and product. Her name became secondary to her silhouette, which circulated more widely than her acting credits. But the rise carried structural pressure beneath the surface. Within the production of Charlie's Angels, Fawcett was originally contracted for a standard television salary structure. Reports from the period indicate she earned roughly $5,000 per episode during her initial run, a figure that became increasingly mismatched with the commercial value she was generating. As merchandising revenue expanded, her poster alone earned her hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties, creating a financial imbalance between on-screen labor and off-screen monetization. That imbalance would later feed into contract disputes and negotiations over image rights. The public perception of her, however, was not shaped by contracts, but by repetition. The girl next door framing became dominant in media coverage, but it was a carefully constructed simplification. Interviews from the period show that she was increasingly aware of how narrowly she was being defined. The same features that made her iconic, her appearance, her hairstyle, her screen presence, were also becoming constraints that limited the kinds of roles she was offered. Typecasting emerged almost immediately after her breakthrough. Career conflicts, legal battles, and reinvention. In 1977, after just 1 season of Charlie's Angels, Farrah Fawcett made a decision that immediately disrupted one of television's most profitable new franchises. She left the series at the height of its cultural dominance, a move that turned a hit show into a legal standoff almost overnight. The studio response was swift and aggressive. ABC and the production company behind the series pursued contractual enforcement, arguing she was bound by multi-year obligations. What followed was a public and legal dispute over breach of contract, with demands reaching into multi-million-dollar territory. At the center of the conflict was a key issue that would later become standard in entertainment law. Who owns the value of a celebrity's likeness when that likeness becomes a product in itself? Her departure exposed a growing fault line in 1970s Hollywood economics. She was not just an actor in a series, She was a merchandising engine. Lunchboxes, posters, dolls, and branded products tied to Charlie's Angels had already turned the cast into licensed assets. Industry reports from the period estimated that her individual poster alone had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties, while broader franchise merchandise was generating millions. The legal tension centered on whether contractual pay adequately reflected the secondary market value. Behind the legal framing, there was a structural shift happening in entertainment. The late 1970s marked the beginning of modern image rights disputes, where actors began challenging the idea that studios could indefinitely control likeness-based revenue. Fawcett's case became one of the early high-visibility examples of that conflict. Although the dispute eventually settled, it left a lasting imprint. Studios became more cautious, and future contracts increasingly accounted for merchandising splits and licensing rights. But the legal battle was only one layer of the transition. Leaving Charlie's Angels also meant stepping out of the most visible platform in American television at the time. The show was still drawing massive audiences, reportedly reaching more than half of U.S. television households during its peak. Exiting that environment meant abandoning guaranteed visibility for uncertain artistic control. The industry interpreted it as both a rebellion and a risk calculation. What followed was not a retreat, but a deliberate repositioning. Fawcett began shifting toward dramatic roles that would distance her from the beauty-first framing that had defined her public image. Casting offers after Angels often still leaned toward glamour roles, but she began rejecting projects that reinforced typecasting. This created a period of uneven output. Fewer roles, but more selective ones, with an emphasis on emotional depth rather than visual branding. The turning point came with The Burning Bed in 1984, a television film based on the real-life case of Francine Hughes, a woman who killed her abusive husband after years of domestic violence. The role required a complete departure from her earlier screen identity. There were no stylized costumes, no glamour framing, only sustained emotional intensity built around trauma and survival. Production notes and interviews from the period describe a physically and emotionally demanding shoot, including extended scenes that required repeated takes under heavy psychological strain. When the film aired, it drew significant critical attention. Unlike her earlier work, reviews focused almost entirely on performance rather than image. She received an Emmy nomination, signaling formal industry recognition of her transition into serious dramatic acting. For many critics, it marked the first time she was evaluated primarily as an actor rather than a cultural icon. That shift continued on stage with Extremities, a Broadway production where she played a woman confronting an attempted assault. The stage environment intensified the performance pressure. Live audiences meant no edits, no retakes, and immediate emotional exposure. Reports from the production noted that performances were physically taxing, with visible exhaustion and emotional strain after shows. Yet it also solidified her credibility in a space far removed from television stardom. Despite these breakthroughs, her post-Angels career was not linear. Film projects during the late 1970s and early 1980s received mixed critical responses. Some productions, including high-profile releases like Logan's Run and Somebody Killed Her Husband, were commercially visible but critically uneven, often criticized for weak scripts or misaligned casting. The industry itself was also in transition. Hollywood at the time was still heavily stratified between television actors and film actors. Moving between mediums meant she was often evaluated against inconsistent standards. A strong television performance might not translate into film credibility. All the while, she was facing other challenges behind the curtain as well: personal life, relationships, and challenges. In Hollywood's ecosystem of visibility, some relationships unfold like stories written for public consumption, and the long connection between Farrah Fawcett and actor Ryan O'Neal became one of the most closely watched examples. It began in 1979, shortly after the peak of her Charlie's Angels fame, when both were already established figures moving through overlapping Hollywood circles. However, From the early stages, the relationship carried instability that was frequently documented in interviews and tabloids. Both had existing careers under pressure. Fawcett transitioning away from television typecasting, O'Neill already known for earlier film success and a highly public personal history. Their connection intensified quickly, but so did public reporting of conflict. Accounts from the 1980s and 1990s repeatedly described patterns of jealousy, separation, and reconciliation, with periods of cohabitation followed by public breakups and later reunions. The relationship became less a linear partnership and more a recurring cycle, often reigniting after years apart. That volatility became more complex with the birth of their son, Redmond O'Neill, in 1985. His arrival created a permanent link between them even during periods of separation. Over time, Redmond's life would become part of the public narrative surrounding both parents. Beginning in the 2000s, he faced repeated legal issues and long-term struggles with substance abuse, leading to multiple arrests and court-ordered treatment programs in California. While family dynamics were unfolding, another significant event emerged in 1997 involving Fawcett and film producer James Orr. During a confrontation at her home, Orr assaulted her in an incident that later resulted in criminal charges. Court proceedings confirmed his conviction, making it one of the few clearly documented legal cases involving physical violence directed at her during her career. The case drew attention not only because of the individuals involved, but because it highlighted the vulnerability of high-profile figures even within private domestic settings. Parallel to these external pressures, Fawcett also faced internal struggles that were less visible at the time, but later acknowledged in interviews. In the early 1980s, during a transitional phase in her career after leaving her television dominance behind, she privately dealt with substance-related issues. These struggles were not widely publicized during that period, largely due to the level of media control and image management typical of major celebrities at the time. However, she later spoke about these experiences more openly. The combination of professional transition, intense media attention, and personal instability created a compressed environment where private life and public narrative were difficult to separate. During this period, her career was shifting toward more serious dramatic roles, but her personal life often overshadowed her professional achievements in media coverage. The constant attention on her relationship with O'Neill, in particular, meant that even career milestones were frequently contextualized through her personal circumstances. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the relationship with O'Neill had become emblematic of long-term Hollywood volatility, less defined by stability and more by recurring reunions after public separations. At different points, they lived together, separated and reunited again, with no single permanent resolution until much later in their lives. This pattern made their relationship unusual even by entertainment industry standards. The emotional complexity of this period was compounded by the demands of parenting a child whose own life was becoming increasingly unstable in adulthood. Redmond O'Neill's legal troubles, including arrests, became recurring news items. Despite these pressures, Fawcett continued working in film and television, often balancing personal instability with professional commitments. What makes this chapter of her life particularly notable is not a single event, but the accumulation of overlapping pressures across relationships, family dynamics, and personal recovery. By the time her later years arrived, these experiences had already shaped how she was perceived in public discourse, not only as a cultural icon from her Charlie's Angels era, but as a figure whose personal life unfolded under unusually persistent scrutiny, with serious consequences. But then, fate took another turn. Later years, illness, and legacy. By the late 1990s, Farrah Fawcett had moved far beyond the mainstream television fame that once defined her through Charlie's Angels. Rather than chasing visibility, she shifted toward more personal and controlled creative work. A major turning point came in 1997 when she surprised the industry by debuting a collection of bronze sculptures, around 19 pieces, many depicting male nudes. These works, sometimes priced near $300,000, divided critics, but firmly established her commitment to serious artistic exploration beyond acting. At the same time, her film choices became more selective and character-driven. Projects like 1997's The Apostle, directed by Robert Duvall, reflected her move away from image-based roles toward more grounded, performance-focused storytelling. She also made occasional appearances in television shows like Ally McBeal. But by this stage, her career had become a series of deliberate, independent choices shaped by personal and artistic priorities. Her life took a dramatic turn in 2006 when she was diagnosed with early-stage anal cancer. She underwent chemotherapy and radiation treatment in Los Angeles and was briefly declared cancer-free in early 2007. However, the disease returned within months and spread to her liver, significantly worsening her condition. Unlike many public figures, she chose not to hide her illness. Instead, she documented her battle in Farrah's Story, a raw, widely viewed documentary that drew nearly 9 million viewers and showed the physical and emotional realities of her treatment. As her condition worsened, she sought experimental therapies in Germany, reflecting her willingness to pursue every possible option. She died on June 25, 2009, at age 62 in Santa Monica, with close companions, including Ryan O'Neal, by her side. Her funeral was held in Los Angeles, and she was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park. Before her death, she established a cancer research foundation, directing millions toward medical studies and awareness efforts. Since then, her legacy has only grown. Her iconic 1970s image continues to resurface. Her bold stand against Hollywood elites is still relevant, and her fight against cancer, even after her own demise, still goes on. This is why everyone is talking about Farrah Fawcett again. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.